Hi, this is Angie Godfrey. This tutorial is to help you learn how to score the stages of each domain once you've administered the GLOSS diagnostic. Many times when I'm administering the GLOSS to students, I find that I start to suspect that they might be using a procedure or an algorithm without really thinking about what the numbers mean. They might be envisioning stacking the numbers or pulling the numbers apart, but I'm not hearing them talk about the value of the numbers as they explain their thinking. The purpose of the GLOSS diagnostic is to understand how the students think about the numbers. If they're using an algorithm or a procedure, I want to make sure that I get to the heart of what they understand about those numbers and why they're doing what they're doing. This example demonstrates how to score the domains if you suspect they're using procedures without the understanding of why it works. So that you can see it better, I'm going to zoom in to this area right here. There we go. As always, we're going to just take a look at this first row, this first section, to determine the stages of each domain. At the end of the first section, it says if any E5s are circled, go on to the next row. There are, so we will. Same here. If any 5s are circled, continue. If any E6s are present, continue. There are 2 6s, the addition subtraction domain, and the ratios and proportions. However, we see that the task 13 was scored as an E6. So we're going to take a look at this multiplication and division domain as an E6. Now, because that is scored right there, if I go back, at the end of this row, it says if any 6s, then go on. So when I go on, I'm going to go on, but I'm only going to assess the domains that have the higher stage. So for this one, I'm not going to need to continue to assess this domain. So we're going to cross those out because we're not going to use that information. And we score this one as an E6. So multiplication and division is scored as an E6. Now let's look at the other 2 in that row. The instructions say if any E7s are circled, then to continue on. Well, I can see that the E7 is circled for the addition subtraction domain. But I also see that the ratio and proportion domain is has circled the lower one. So we're going to look at the ratio and proportion domain first before we go to the addition subtraction domain. And as we do, we see that we did not need to continue to assess that one. So I'm just going to cross that one out, and I'm going to score the ratio and proportion domain as a stage 6. Now, going on to addition subtraction. At this point, we see that the student couldn't solve it. They tried a couple of things. They tried regrouping with decimals, we think, but the final answer that they came up with was not correct. So we score that as a cannot solve, which technically would be that E7. So if we were done here, and we felt like we had a good understanding of the student's thinking, we would score addition subtraction as E7, multiplication division as E6, and ratios and proportions as a 6. However, I have a concern here, and I'm wondering if you can see it in that addition subtraction domain. Look at task 15. Based on what's written here, I'm wondering if this student is thinking about value or if they're splitting numbers apart because they're envisioning the stacking. So they did get to the correct answer, but there's not enough here as an interviewer for me to really think about whether or not they're saying a tenth or 200ths or 2 wholes or 23. When they spoke in terms of digits, not values. So I'm a little concerned about that. If we go back to task 12, I see something very similar. After explaining it, the teacher wrote down that they stacked it, borrowed, and subtracted. And that's how they got their answer. Again, very procedural. So if we're going to borrow, instead of think of I'm taking a 10 away from those 8 and now I have 7 10s. But the student didn't explain it in a way that helped me understand that. It was more, I'm going to take away from the 8, put the 1 over by the 2, and now I can subtract it. And this is really what they were visualizing. So again, there's this procedure here, but I haven't heard anything or hadn't heard anything in their language that suggested they were thinking about that 8 and that 7 in terms of 80 or 8 10s. So I'm going to go back, and I do notice on this task 9, not only is the answer incorrect, but when the students split up the numbers, they split them entirely by digits. So if I take a look at this overall column, other than task 6, well, task 6 doesn't have any numbers being decomposed. So I look at this and think there's really not any evidence that this student is decomposing these numbers in a way where they're demonstrating that they understand the value of the numbers. And as the interviewer was assessing this kiddo, we found that to be the case when they, like on task 12, when they described their thinking, oh, I just stacked it. Well, how did you know you could take the 1 from the 8 and put it, because that's how you do it. So, as much as I dug on this kiddo, I could not get much out other than procedure. They didn't even self-correct and say, well, that's not an 8, that's an 80. There was no self-correction, and I had to be careful not to lead with my questioning. So, rather than score this an E6 or an E7, as the bottom of the column might indicate, I think this needs to be scored a 5. First and foremost, because they couldn't solve it, and they didn't get it right. So the additional tests 12, 15, and 18 would never have been assessed anyway. But also because there's no indication that they're actually thinking about the meaning of these numbers. It seemed pretty procedural. So up at the top, we're going to change that E7 to a stage 5. Now, looking at the whole thing, we have several tasks that didn't need to be administered, but task 9 was a cannot solve, and that would have been scored a stage 5, multiplication, division, an E6, and ratios and proportion, also a 6. So when you suspect that there is a procedure without place value understanding, we need to be very careful about how we score those. We also need to be careful about how we question our kids during those interviews so that we're not leading them to a self-correction in a way that prompts them that they should be saying things a certain way. Anyway, hope this helps. You're doing good things, and have a great day. Bye.